Hi everyone, I'm Logan Williams, and I'd like to welcome you to this Arise Festival event discussing the Paris Commune, glorious harbinger of a new society. Today's forum is hosted by Labour Outlook, which is a fast-growing website bringing you daily news and views from across the left and those at the forefront of resisting the Tories. Today's part of our new Socialist Ideas series of discussions, more information of which can be found in the chat on the YouTube. Those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and we can't hope to transform the world without understanding it. So I'm really enjoying this series of Friday discussions. We've looked at Gramsci, where there was a few hundred of us, Marx and Engels, and Sylvia Pankhurst. And today we're going to be looking at the Paris Commune, one of the foundational events of socialist history. For our discussion today, we're joined by Sandra Bloodworth. Sandra is a socialist activist and Australian Labour historian. She's written on numerous aspects of socialist theory and history, including through being a contributor to the Paris Commune and Ode to Emancipation collection of essays, which I highly recommend. It's fantastic. So, just a quick one before we get into it, because I know we're all very keen to start to get this going. Please let us know where you're tuning in from on the chat on YouTube, and we look forward to seeing your comments about it. And also make sure, if you're really enjoying the event, make sure you're trying to get other people involved by tweeting Labour Outlook at Labour Outlook or Arise Festival on the at Arise_Festival. And if you can donate, please donate to the link provided. And if you can, make sure you're buying a ticket to cover the whole cost of Arise, a festival of left ideas. We still need more to sell more tickets to cover the cost of this whole month. And I hope that we are enjoying this whole month, because I definitely have been. And if you've already got your ticket, why not become a friend of Arise for £5 a month and help us expand and continue to grow these series of events which happen across the whole year, not just within this month. So let's start to get into the Paris Commune a little bit more, because I am excited. So the Paris Commune of 1871 is still celebrated and studied throughout the world. It's one of the first working class attempts at emancipation, direct democracy, and social change, with changes introduced that still have not been won in many countries today. This event's going to have a look at what happened in the Commune and how it continues to inspire us today as we struggle for a better future. Over to you, Sandra.
Thanks, Logan. Well, I agree with your introduction to why we're talking about the Commune. So let's start with what Marx wrote of the historical importance of the Commune. He said, "This was the first revolution in which the working class was openly acknowledged as the only class capable of social initiative, even by the great bulk of the Paris middle class, shopkeepers, tradesmen, merchants, the wealthy capitalists alone excepted." And so I want to begin with a sketch of the context and the space in which the uprising of the 18th of March 1871 exploded. Belleville, side by side with Montmartre, where it all began, is described by Stuart Edward in his documentary history of the Commune as the most solidly working class district in all of Paris and the most revolutionary. Now, Paris had been transformed by Baron Haussmann in the service of Napoleon Bonaparte. New wide boulevards cut swathes through workers' districts, destroying their homes, something a lot of us know of even today. And the poor had crowded into Montmartre and Belleville, where they lived in appalling poverty and squalor, right beside scenes of the wealthy's magnificent homes and elegant stores and cafes, built over the top of workers' demolished neighbourhoods. A London Times correspondent described Montmartre as rugged open spaces where the lawless crowds of these parts loved to hold their meetings and park their cannon. And he refers to the cannon because just 3 weeks ago, hundreds of workers had helped the National Guard, a popular militia, move 250 cannon from military barracks into Belleville and Montmartre. They needed the cannon to defend themselves against bombardment by Bismarck. That's the workers, why they wanted to defend them. And Bonaparte had gone to war against Germany last July for the glory of France, but Bismarck's superior Prussian army had kept Paris under siege from the 19th of September to the end of January. And of course, workers made up the vast majority of the 60,000 who had died of hunger and cold. Adolphe Thiers, hated as the butcher who repressed the 1848 revolution, had moved his newly elected government and their troops to Versailles. And so we basically, when the commune gets going, we have a situation that Lenin would later call dual power, of two powers tussling for who is going to rule. Now, Adolphe Thiers had signed an armistice with Bismarck now, which included an agreement to crush Red Paris. So on the 18th of March at dawn, sleepy workers emerging from their homes begin to notice that Thiers' soldiers are preparing to remove their cannon. Fortuitously, General Pinault, displaying the general incompetence of his class, had forgotten to bring horses to move the cannon. So they had some time, and so women began offering bread and wine to the underfed soldiers, asking, "Why are you stealing our cannon?" And the crowd is swelling now, transforming itself from sleepy spectators to increasingly angry and active participants. An observer described the unfolding events as horses arrived. Women and children swarming up the hillside in a compact mass. The artillery tried in vain to fight their way through the crowd, but the waves of people engulfed everything, surging over the cannon mounts, over the ammunition wagons, under the wheels, under the horses' feet, paralyzing the advance of the soldiers. And Louise Michel, one of the most flamboyant of the radicals, would later recall of these moments. Crowds like this are sometimes the vanguard of the ocean of humanity. But it was not death that awaited us. No, it was the surprise of a popular victory. General Leconte 3 times orders the soldiers to fire on the crowd, and a woman challenges the soldiers. "Are you going to fire on us, on our brothers, on our husbands, on our children?" Leconte threatens to shoot any soldier who refuses to do just that. And as they hesitate, he asks, "Are you going to surrender to that scum?" A non-commissioned officer steps out from the ranks and calls out, "Turn your guns around and put your rifle butts up in the air." And to everyone's amazement, the soldiers obey. Now, Verdiger, that young officer, will later be shot for this action. But the revolution has begun. An officer penned a typical report. "We were stopped by a crowd of several hundred, principally children and women. The infantry detachment completely forgot their duty and dispersed into the crowd, succumbing to its perfidious seductions and ending by turning up their rifle butts." The London Times correspondent, returning from similar scenes around Belleville, visits the barricade where he had witnessed the laying of the first stone in Montmartre, and it had now, he says, grown to considerable dimensions, because everyone who passes must add a stone from piles on each side of the street, and the stones are usually being assembled by energetic children having the time of their lives, presumably. Now, new barricades were springing up in every direction, the correspondent writes. Instead of a government blocking every street, as was the case in the morning, a hostile cannon was now looking down every street. So we've just witnessed how revolutions happen. The attempted seizure of the cannon had unleashed a well of bitterness fed by 2 decades of dictatorship, poverty, and the ravages of Bismarck's siege. By midday, Hotel de Ville, the magnificent Paris town hall, was seized by the National Guard. So if you think about it, after just one morning of rebellion, they now have the confidence to occupy this grand building at the heart of political power. And the Commune will create the most democratic institutions known to humanity at that time. The Universal Commune, they called it, a radical social innovation. The National Guard's leadership, lacking experience and confidence, because they hadn't been formed that much earlier, they let the mostly conservative mayors set the rules for an election to a committee for the Commune, and which they call, as they were calling it. So for one thing, it excluded women from the vote. It wasn't totally democratic. But contrary to much that's written about the Commune, this did not exclude women from the activities which flourished. The democratic innovations of the mass of workers themselves in spite of the limited democracy of the mayor's election, were a historic step forward. All elected officials could be recalled at any time, and what's more, all kinds of civic officials like judges, magistrates and top public servants were to be elected on the same basis, and they would just receive a worker's wage. So the whole structure differed fundamentally from even the most democratic capitalist states. Those elected or appointed to officials' positions would share the consequences of their decisions with no privileges to hide behind. And even enemies of the commune couldn't help but convey the joyous atmosphere, which is typical of all revolutions. 10 days later, one of them recorded the experience of standing in front of the Hotel de Ville while the names of those elected to the commune committee were read out. And he wrote, "I write these lines still full of emotion. 100,000 perhaps armed men spilled out of every nearby street, and the sharp points of the bayonets glittering in the sun made the place seem like a field of lightning. The music playing was the Marseillaise, the song taken up in 50,000 resolute voices. This thunder shook all the people. An immense sea of banners, bayonets and caps surging. The cannon still thundered, but they were heard only in intervals between the singing. Then all the sounds merged into a single cheer, the universal voice of the countless multitude, and all these people had but one heart, just as they had but one voice." So the old state power had been demolished, and this for Marx was of momentous importance. Paris, the central seat of the old governmental power, and at the same time the social stronghold of the French working class, had risen in arms against Thiers, he writes. Paris had got rid of the army and replaced it by a National Guard, the bulk of which consisted of working men. The first decree of the Commune, therefore, was the suppression of the standing army and the substitution for it of the armed people. And the structures they created were, Marx argued, the political form at last discovered under which to work out the economical emancipation of labour, because Marx had been arguing since the 1848 revolution in the 18th Brumaire, for instance, that workers would not be able to just use the capitalist state. They had to destroy it and take over themselves, but he didn't actually know how that would happen. This is the first concrete illustration of carrying out that theoretical position. And now, after the experience of taking matters into their own hands, the population enthusiastically joined in the debates and activities in dozens of radical clubs. So let me introduce you to some of the key, most radical figures with years of experience in workers' struggles and close to Marx. Elizabeth Dmitriev. She was a Russian revolutionary who'd spent the last month or so in London, went to Paris at Marx's request. On April the 18th, on her initiative, an appeal to the women citizens of Paris was posted on walls around the city and published in the newspapers of the Commune. "Can you hear the cannons roar and the tocsin sound its sacred call? To arms! Is it the foreigner who's come to invade France? No, these enemies, these assassins of the people and of liberty, are the French. This combat to the death is the final act in the eternal antagonism between right and might, between work and exploitation, between the people and their tyrants. Citoyenne, the gauntlet has been thrown. It is necessary to vanquish or to die. We must prepare to defend and avenge our brothers." Can you imagine having that on the walls in our cities today? I suppose it might come up as a meme, but people knew how to express themselves at those days. It signified the launch by Elizabeth Dmitriev of the Union des Femmes, or the Union of Women. It became the largest and most effective organisation in the Commune, meeting daily in almost every one of the 20 arrondissements. The membership was dominated by women workers in the garment trades, like seamstresses, laundresses, and the like. And the union's discussions included theoretical questions about ending private property and the issues of gender-based inequality, as well as solving the day-to-day struggle to provide food and fuel to families. They participated in the defence of the Commune, maintenance of the barricades, turning to the sick and wounded. In cooperation with the Commune Committee and its Labour Commission, they provided well-paid work under women workers' control. Nathalie Lamel was a bookbinder, allied with Marx in the First International, and she worked closely with Dmitriev, as did Benoit Malon. He helped set up an asylum for orphans where they could be offered basic instruction. Paul Mink opened one of the first schools for girls. She requisitioned a Jesuit school because it was endowed with the most advanced equipment and laboratories. And there's so many things we could talk about that they actually raised as reforms, which we can do in the discussion if people want. But night work for bakers was abolished, but there was actually a big debate about it because the anarchists in the committee actually didn't think that the Bakuninists, they didn't think that the state should decide anything, and it took a big tussle to get it agreed that actually night work was going to be abolished. Now, Edward Vaillant set up a professional school of industrial art for girls, which introduced a new approach to teaching. Any skilled worker over the age of 40 could apply to become a professor. Free education with no church interference for both girls and boys. And teachers' salaries were raised with equal pay for women and men. Secular nurseries were set up, and we get a glimpse of some of what those children were taught. Because a gentleman wrote about how he witnessed a band of 200 toddlers marching behind a drum and a small red flag. They sing at the top of their lungs, La Marseillaise. This grotesque parade celebrated the opening of a lay school organised by the Commune. The churches were taken over as meeting places for the clubs, schools, and other community activities, though they did allow time for the usual prayers and ceremonies that religious people were used to carrying out. And Le Sageret, a member of the International and author of one of the first books published about the Commune, penned a description of one club meeting beneath the soaring ceilings and beautiful stained glass windows of one of the big churches. The revolution mounts the pulpits. Almost hidden by the shadow of the vaults hangs the figure of Christ, draped in the popular oriflamme. The organ and the people chant the Marseillaise. They discuss the events of the day, the means of defence. The members of the Commune committee are severely censured, and vigorous resolutions are voted to be presented to the Hotel de Ville the next day. So, occupying these odes to privilege and power, and under the influence of the radicals, many of whom have been involved in workers' struggles for many years, workers embraced reforms well ahead of their times, and in fact, as Logan said, often things that people still have not won today in most of the world. Allowances for widows of men killed defending the Commune, whether officially married or not, and their children, whether legitimate or not. At the urging of some of the clubs, the Commune endorsed the right to abortion. Any businesses whose owners had fled to Versailles were taken over and put under workers' control. And significantly, even though they had suffered under Bismarck's siege, they were determinedly internationalist, inspiring support around Europe, including thousands of demos in London, which I know about. And the Jewish-Hungarian worker, Leo Frankel, collaborator of Marx, was Commissioner of Labour. 2 Poles were given responsibility for organising defence. And most famously of all, skilled engineers and workers demolished the imperialistic Vendôme column bearing Bonaparte's statue on the top. And the Place Vendôme, unharmed because of their careful planning as it fell down, was renamed Internationale Place. Now, Gustave Courbet, the artist, he was persecuted for the rest of his life because he was accused of ordering the demolition, which has never been proven, and he established an artists' federation. Eugène Potier, author of the song The Internationale, wrote its founding manifesto. And the Federation held all kinds of debates, debating the role of the artist in society and all the rest of it. And it attracted well-known artists such as Corot, Manet, and Daumier, who scorned those who, such as Cézanne, Pissarro, and Degas, associated with the reactionaries in Versailles. So you might want to keep those names in mind next time you attend one of the blockbuster exhibitions that tour around the world. Now, Marx commented about all these innovations. What does this tremendous change prove to the bourgeois mind of all countries? Why, that the Commune has conspired against civilization. and the unbridled savagery that the government unleashed at the end of May in the bloody week known as La Semaine Sanglante should be burnt into the consciousness of every anti-capitalist. For anyone who hopes that we will be able to transition from capitalism to socialism in a peaceful way should take pause. Government troops massacred at least 30,000, about 38,000 were arrested, and more than 7,000 deported. Thousands fled into exile. In the last hours, Nathalie Lamel took command of a contingent of the Union des Femmes. They marched, red flag in the lead, to defend a barricade under fire. The barricade Le Sagare dubbed the legendary barricade. There, 120 women held back government troops for several hours. One of many who were shot was the dressmaker Blanche Lefebvre, an organiser of the Union. Nathalie Lamel cared for the wounded for hours. Their comrade Elizabeth Dmitrieff was at Montmartre with Louise Michel and Leo Frankel to the last hours. Women, men, and children chose to die bravely rather than surrender. Courage was their last revolutionary act. But on the other side, respectable women holding their dainty handkerchiefs trimmed with lace made by women workers who were now thrown into filthy dungeons took guided tours of those dungeons to gloat at the suffering of those women incarcerated there. They took particular pleasure in poking them with their parasols. And these images are of warning. The respectable middle classes, thought to be so cultured, revelled in the barbarity that was unleashed to restore them to their rightful privileged place. Now, much was made, and still is made by many people, of women burning historic buildings. And they surely did, along with men and children, because fire was a weapon of defence, and Marx defended it, and so should we. He wrote, "While tearing to pieces the living body of the proletariat, its rulers must no longer expect to return triumphantly into the intact architecture of their abodes. The government of Versailles cries incendiarism. The bourgeoisie of the whole world, which looks complacently upon the wholesale massacre, is convulsed by horror at the desecration of brick and mortar." And after the killing, the powerful and respectable set out to obliterate the memory of the example of the kind of world that workers can create if only they can take power. The Vendôme column was rebuilt as a priority. On Montmartre, the huge church of the Sacre-Cœur was built to eradicate the memory and the things they were desperately wanting to be, no one to ever remember, is the holy water replaced with piles of tobacco. They wanted to obliterate the sight of statues of the Virgin Mary wearing the fighter's uniform, red flag in hand, and a cigar in her mouth, watching over debates about the need for secular education for all and women's rights, including abortion. Reactionaries like Pissarro played their role. Saccharine representations of genteel street scenes and homely bliss in stately homes reassured the middle class that La Semaine Sanglante had secured Paris for their pleasure. But they could never erase the memory completely. Members of the Artists' Federation created powerful images of ruling class barbarism as a warning for future generations. Manet's Guerre Civile is perhaps the best known, but Courbet's depiction of children in his cell and the Federé lying dead in the streets seems less so, but his reputation protects it from total oblivion. And you can still see reminders in Paris of Louise Michel, Nathalie Lamel, and Elizabeth Dmitrieff, with squares named after them and various plaques and memorials. On May Day 1901, thousands joined the funeral procession for Paul Mink through the streets of Paris, chanting "Vive la Commune" and "Vive Internationale" in her honour. More than 600 police, 500 soldiers, and 100 cavalry guarded the streets against a repeat of 1871, indicating that the ruling class was still haunted by the Sphinx of workers' rebellion, as Marx put it. More than 100,000 attended Louise Michel's funeral in Paris in 1905, honouring her ceaseless rebellion to the end. And I would say her image is much better known around the world than that of Thiers or any of his henchmen. Socialists and anarchists celebrated the Commune and its achievements every year for decades. They remembered with pride the courage of children, women and men who chose to die honourably rather than surrender. Their bravery stood as a symbol of resistance to the depravity of capitalism. Even in Broken Hill, a remote mining city here in Australia, celebrated the Commune during its years of industrial and socialist militancy every year until it began to decline in the 1920s. The Communards Wall at the Père Lachaise Cemetery, where 166 Commune soldiers were executed on May 28, is still a mecca for leftists who go there to renew their sense of commitment. So the points I want to leave you with are these. Revolutions are inevitable in this inhumane, crisis-ridden system. The Commune was not an example of socialism, but as Lenin argued, a harbinger of that possibility. Living under siege, groping for the way forward, this first workers' revolution showed the kind of democratic structures which are part of the dynamic of the collective struggles of the oppressed when they're led by the working class, structures which can and should replace the capitalist state. And we see them and the astonishing creativity, collectivity, and radical reforms that revolutionary struggles produce in a much more developed form in the 20th century, beginning with Russia in 1905 and 1917 in the workers' revolutions, when the working class had become, a more serious force and was, much more a dominant force in society, because in Paris, the working class were in mostly small workplaces and a minority in society. As Marx and Engels had argued as young men in the German ideology, it is such struggle which can make workers fit to found society anew. And I would argue that belief in this possibility of self-emancipation is the heart and soul of Marxism, and that is why I think preserving the history of the Commune is so precious. And I'll finish there.
Thank you so much, Sandra. That was fascinating and really enlightening. As somebody who's only ever read sort of basic introductions to the Commune, that was really detailed and really lovely. So just while I let you get a drink of water and just rest a little bit before going into some of these questions that we have for you, I'd just like to introduce Matt Gwilbreth, who is an Labour Outlook contributor and Arise Festival volunteer, who's going to tell you a little bit more about what we can do to support the Arise Festival going forwards. Over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Logan, and thank you, Sandra, and thank you, everyone who's watching. This festival goes on for a month, as you know, and as Logan mentioned at the start, please, if you haven't bought a ticket yet, they start at just £4, please do so. It's a purely voluntary operation, but putting on over, I think, 20 events over the month does cost quite a lot of money on technical and other infrastructure, so please do buy your ticket. If you want to watch back any sessions in this Socialist Ideas season that you've missed on Marx and Engels and the Crisis, or on Sylvia Pankhurst, or the first one on Gramsci, you can do that on the YouTube channel. And if you are really enjoying these sessions and enjoying the Arise Festival, then why not become a friend of Arise at the link provided in the chat and give us some regular support. The festival's still going on at this stage. There's a big session that a lot of you would have registered for already with Jeremy Corbyn and global guests on Monday, June the 26th. And then we're proud for the first time this year to have our closing rally joint with the Socialist Future Current of Comrades in Young Labour on the left. And that's on Wednesday, the 28th. And you can also get your tickets there for that specifically at the link provided. Also, one final thing, please do. Today's session is hosted with Labour Outlook, the blog. Please do follow Labour Outlook on social media and check it out daily for discussion on the left. And one final thing, the next Socialist Ideas session outside of the Arise Festival will be on Hugo Chavez and his relevance in the 21st century with Ian Bruce, who many of you will know, the author of Real Venezuela and journalist at Al Jazeera, and details on that will also be posted in the chat. Thank you, Logan.
Thank you, Matt, and hopefully for those of us who are listening there for maybe the first time, or hopefully not for the first time, will be interested in buying one of those tickets for just £4, or even just making a little start there and telling us where you're from in our chat. So, Sandra, if it's okay with you, let's get into some of these questions, which we have got prepared for you to try and complement that excellent overview you gave us there. And the first question we really want to ask is, you went into some detail there about some of those key women who were able to help lead and form and are at the forefront of both building and defending the commune's attempts to build a new society. I was just wondering if you could go into a bit of detail about how the commune affected the position of women in France and the global socialist movement following its repression.
Mm. Yes, it's actually very interesting how advanced the ideas were about women, and partly it was that people like Natalie Lamel in particular, and one of the men she'd been involved with, they had been involved amongst women workers for quite a long time before the commune, so they were quite experienced. And but in the context of such a reactionary role of the church, like the church would not recognize women's children as their, legitimate children if they weren't married in the church, and if the children weren't baptized and all the rest of it. But all these things cost money, and the charges, like workers often couldn't afford them. So the church basically excludes them anyway. And then, their life is made miserable by the state. So that, because the church and the state, in spite of what they said in the French Revolution, are not so separate. And it's interesting reading in the radical clubs, like the women were often the most militant, like they were quite impatient. They used to be objecting to the Commune Committee wouldn't implement the things that people wanted quickly enough, because the committee necessarily was some of the more conservative people. It's all the people in the streets and in the clubs who were the most radical. And so, like, I think it's Kirsten Ross who comments that they represent, and the reforms they called for, they represent the actual life of the working class much more than, all the rules and regulations. If you just look at all that, that the life of the work, and the commune obviously represented that. And so that's why, women's right to free love, women's right to abortion, the care of children, widows when the men were killed on the barricades and all the rest of it. And some of the things that aren't necessarily seen when people talk about the women that changed their lives radically was the controls on rent, and they put a ban on selling goods that were put into the pawn shops so that people could go back and get them when they could. And so small things like that, people don't always think of them as women's issues, but they made a huge difference to women's lives.
Fantastic. And like I say, some of those issues I think are often overlooked even in the modern progressive and labour movements as being women's issues more directly than potentially men. And so let's move on a little bit onto sort of around the repression. And obviously mainstream histories, as we both know, and I think hopefully a lot of people know, often offer ruling class perspectives on a key event, and obviously have an interest in ignoring the violence and the savagery of the repression of progressive movements like the Paris Commune. I was just wondering if you could go into a little bit of detail about the reality of the savage repression of the Commune as opposed to the sort of almost sanitized mainstream perspectives there.
Yes, because, well, the thing that they made a huge fuss about, and there's an element of sort of sexism in the whole thing of, if you can paint the women as being so violent, that makes, it must be a real mark against the Commune. And so I think even some feminist writing, they concentrate on, did the women really do this? They think that it does discredit this Commune if you admit that the women did burn down big buildings and things. It's sort of, like that sense that, well, women wouldn't be the ones who are leading the violence, but like everyone knew, if we don't defeat them as they can't, because the troops are coming in, and there's an agreement between both Bismarck and Pierre that they know that people are just going to be slaughtered, and so burning buildings was a way of holding them back. And anyway, it becomes a thing of revenge, that they're not going to, as Marx says, they don't have any entitlement to come here and take back this architecture for themselves. And so, I think it's quite important that we defend the thing, because even some of the historians who are more left-wing, and they don't want to come out and totally condemn it, but they spend a lot of time arguing, oh, did the women really participate? It was just all the men. And, because there is a reluctance to admit that the women played a self-active role. Like, people are always trying to find ways to show that, because it was men that were elected to those official committees and stuff. And their eye isn't on where the real radicalism and involvement was. And so Donny Gluckstein, the SWP member in Britain, he has a lovely history of the Commune, where he goes into a lot of detail about the connection between the radical clubs and the Commune committee, and that they actually, he goes through how they actually did play a role in influencing what that committee agreed to, and the committee then, feeding back. Whereas that's often ignored. People just look at what the committee was like, and I think with the burning the buildings and that, a lot of the stuff that's recorded is all about the men. And so it seems like, oh, well, men burnt the buildings, but the women took quite a lot of pride in the fact that they fought just as hard as the men did. And it was interesting when I read the records at Broken Hill of the trade unions, that mining town I mentioned, that they, like Tom Mann from Britain, came there to organise a lockout. Well, they knew a lockout was coming, and he came there to organise the unions. And he always was giving speeches about the women in the Paris Commune. This was what women could do everywhere, because, of course, it was a male-dominated workforce because of the mining. And so it's interesting that workers themselves want to celebrate the women fighting and saw it as a way of mobilising and giving themselves confidence, whereas a lot of historians want to downplay it. People don't like the idea that women might be as violent as the men, which is, women had as big a stake in everything as the men did. I got off the topic a little bit there, but
that's okay. But it's fascinating. Obviously, like you said, it builds into that internationalist perspective there of Tom Mann, the British syndicalist, using those ideas to sort of motivate a new generation of workers. So the next two questions, which I'll probably do together, is around worker-controlled industry and democracy. So in Britain at the moment, we have a huge contemporary debate within both the British left and more broadly the Labour movement around public ownership. And it's sometimes viewed around public ownership, and it's sometimes viewed as a top-down, state-led process. And from your discussion earlier, it seemed like the Paris Commune was an alternative to these. So the first part of it will be around that, and what could the Paris Commune offer us as an alternative to this idea of top-down, state-led industry. And the second part is going to be about the fact that, as a young socialist who sort of was politicised during the Corbyn years from 2015 to 2020 in the British Labour movement, we're sort of always confronted with the idea that the transformation of society to a socialist one is inherently undemocratic. And I think from, again, what you're saying, the Paris Commune is clearly the antithesis of that. It clearly is a socialist vision of a vision of democracy which could be used in the socialist transformation, in opposition to the idea that democracy is just crossing a box every 5 years. So if you can answer those two, that would be fantastic.
So is that debate about public ownership happening today, you mean?
Yeah, definitely. So
Oh, yeah. I haven't been following that
it's
much.
yeah. I mean,
Been
it's
following the strikes.
no.
But
I think it's sort of coming in as a part of that, sort of looking for that alternative
yeah,
of we're not just. I think the Labour movement on the left's trying to not just be what we're against as part of the strikes, we're trying to build that positive sort of what we're for. And I think that it is a debate that is definitely still waging, and I think has been waging in the British Labour movement, sadly, since about the 1970s.
yeah. The trouble is that it is true that, like, is why people, like, privatisation is being carried out, and when privatisation was happening, we fought it tooth and nail at every step because it was. But these questions are very concrete. Like, it was because government services were run down and prepared for them, preparing the population to accept privatisation. So public services of all sorts, like public transport, similar here to Britain, everything. We still at least have some public health. They get sold off. Our electricity grid was all state-owned, but then they get sold off. But it is true. People think if you just say, oh, we should renationalise, it doesn't seem, people remember back that they weren't any better then anyway. And I think that's the problem with the way the question's posed and sort of try to answer, because under capitalism, pretty much anything the government does and what the capitalists agree to do sort of as part that fits with their program will of necessity not be democratic. They can't run anything democratically because they make profits in an undemocratic way. They have to have a working class that works and produces more wealth than what they're paid. And so that creates the authoritarian nature of the system. And for all the trimmings of democracy, everything basically is run from top down. And so, see, in reply to people saying we're just negative, my attitude is we're not negative. What is negative about demanding that women get more rights? That we're against the bans on women. We're for increased wages. We're for workers having more industrial rights so that, if they're being badly treated, they can walk out, whether it's private or whether it's government. Because in the past, the left did, I think, and partly because it was seen as an advance, well, definitely here in Australia, having state-run railways and electricity system was seen as so much more advanced than places like, well, I don't know, I can't remember, but places that didn't have them nationalised. But people don't see that. That's not an answer to the question, because no one thinks that taking the services back into government hands are going to be any better, because the governments are talking all the time about austerity. Now they're preparing for war. Here in Australia, they're going to spend $500 billion on nuclear submarines. And, at the same time, workers are expected to take all kinds of cuts to our services. So just saying that our positive alternative is to put them back in the hands of the government, I don't think it holds. And I think we can, well, to be honest, I think it's a very positive thing for people to fight against having nuclear-powered submarines in a country that's got a history of opposing nuclear, and we have held it at bay for decades, and now they're coming in the form of a war machine. I think we have to be more confident to say they're the alternatives. And yeah, so I don't know, you may not feel that answers the question, but I'm not really for. In Australia, we don't really we do say that it should be taken back in public hands, but it's sort of more a propaganda point to point out that bosses have just ruined everything. But, no one, even with the Labor Party, and the Labor Party's set about attacking everyone. So why would anyone think it's going to be better? So will we go on to, the second question was about,
Sort of the direct democracy aspects of the commune.
Yes. Yeah, I know. Well, see, the people who write books that say it's all undemocratic, they're written by the classes that think they have a God-given right to rule. And it's quite obvious that if the massive workers take over, well, some middle class people can play a role, but they have to be supporting the revolution. Like capitalists that have spent their whole lives and their families have built up their wealth on exploiting workers, well, they are excluded because, and I think someone even said it in one of the revolutions, but anything, I think we can say, if you're worried about not being part of having democratic rights, go and get a job in a workplace somewhere, and you'll have all the rights that everyone else has got when people are electing people to workers' committees, when they're forming all kinds of interacting structures to help reorganize society. Everyone can participate in them. It's just that they don't want to have a democratic society because you actually can't run an exploitative system democratically. And they know if there's a genuine democracy where people at the grassroots are actually having a say, well, they'll have to give up a lot of their wealth and power. They won't be regarded as wonderful and having a born to rule right. And, and I think we have to be really confident about that because, as I mentioned, the better examples really are 1917 and others in like Hungary in 56 and Poland in 1981 against the Stalinist monstrosities. But, when you get a mass working class that's the majority in society and they have huge workplaces and they can actually organise more. The Paris Commune, I think it is really important to keep in mind, it's, as Marx said, a harbinger of what's to come. But it does show you how far-sighted Marx was because people today even say, oh, workers couldn't run society and this and that. Workers were a tiny minority in Europe, and the working class in France in particular was still in quite small workplaces. There were only half a dozen or so that had more than 1,000 workers in them. And yet Marx could see this glimmer of the future. Look at what happens when workers lead a struggle, because they can't organise by exploiting other people because that's not the kind of class they are. They have to organise collectively if they're going to organise. And if they don't organise democratically and collectively, their struggles don't keep developing, I would argue. And so I think it's the most profound kind of democracy and involvement of people. And like you see it even when there's mass strikes and that, people start getting involved in all kinds of strike committees, and the union bureaucrats often try to stop all that. But if there's socialists and people who have a vision, you can use the historical lessons to point out we can all do this ourselves and involve people in the democratic structures from below to actually try to get a struggle to go in the direction that they want to go. I mean, a lot of these traditions have just got to be rebuilt because they've been lost with the decline of the workers' movement and its struggles.
Of course.
At least you have got a lot of strikes. You're in Britain, aren't you, Logan?
Yeah, we definitely do. I'm a teacher, so I've been part of the largest teacher strikes in over a generation. So it's
we haven't. We've got a pretty dismal situation here, and now the unions won't do much because they don't want to oppose the Labor government.
Okay, which is an issue.
But still, some unions in one of the ports organised quite a sized rally a couple of weeks ago because everybody can see if they have nuclear-powered warships in their ports, there could be an accident, but also they'll be a target as soon as war breaks out with China. And here, I don't think probably not. And there's a parallel as well. Look, even though the workers have been under siege from Bismarck, they've got Bismarck on one side and they've got Thiers on the other. Even though they're supposed to be at war, they've made an agreement to crush Paris. And yet the workers are just so determined to be internationalists, reach out to workers. That is going to be a huge question for the working class in the coming period, because here in Australia, the war hysteria is becoming, quite threatening, because there's a new agreement that Britain's part of as well, AUKUS.
Yeah, the AUKUS deal.
Are you talking about that there?
Yeah, we have a session on peace coming up, which I'm sure will tackle.
Oh, great, it'll come up there.
AUKUS.
So the Paris Commune is I think, signal of the absolute humanity and decency of the working class right from its earliest days, which of course you can see a lot of in Britain as well, beginning actually in the English Revolution. And these are the things everyone is going to have to relearn to face up to the growing crisis in the system. And so I think revolutions will start to happen, because I tried to bring out that the revolution didn't happen because the revolutionaries made it happen. It came out of the oppression and the poverty and the degradation of the system. And then I think possibly the last point, because we're probably running out of time, is that I would make is that the preparation beforehand is so precious, because the people that I picked out, they had spent years in workers' struggles themselves. They knew how workers think. They had related to them. They had argued a lot of points. They knew the oppression that workers suffer. They knew which points where workers were going to be open to their arguments. The hatred of the church opened them up to a lot of the issues about women's rights. Now, some of those in the West, we've won a lot of those arguments. It's hardly like in the West, most people support the old positions of women. But to be honest, in America, people still have to fight some of those battles. And so, you know, I think the Paris Commune is the beginning of the history of that class that is the future of humanity, really.
Yeah. Okay, so as you say, I think that was an excellent point to finish on there. I think the strong finish there to a session which actually I've been really proud to be part of. This has been really excellent, and I think to a lot of our listeners and viewers will be something that's really educational, which is, you know, like as you say, that birthplace almost of the working class movement. So I just want to say thank you to all of our watchers and viewers for taking part this afternoon, and obviously to you, Sandra, our excellent speaker. Please.
Can I just make a plug for my article, because it's got a lot more detail as well. In the Marxist Left Review, if people Google my name and the Paris Commune, and Marxist Left Review is a Socialist Alternatives theoretical journal that I'm one of the editors. I've got the article we published on the centenary of the 150 years it was.
Oh, fantastic.
2021.
Awesome. So check out that article, which I think I have also read, which is excellent. I think it was one of the few that I've checked out before starting this call. And just want to remind our viewers to please do make sure you buy a ticket for the whole of Arise, the Festival of Left Ideas. We still need, as I said, to sell plenty more, because we are a team of volunteers to cover the cost of this amazing month and to build our infrastructure to get even bigger and better to try and face these crises that we're facing on all fronts. And obviously, if you can, why not become a friend of Arise and help for £5 a month, help us expand. We hope you really have enjoyed this event. In terms of future sessions at Arise, there will be the major discussion next Monday at 6:30 p.m. with Jeremy Corbyn and global guest entitled A World to Win, which promises to be quite an interesting event, I'm sure. So please do register, and many thanks again to Sandra and our viewers for taking part.